Hello, everyone. It's Mrs. Wallace. I hope you're having a good day. Happy Friday. So, as you know, you have a quiz on Tuesday, and you have been working on some benchmarks in the last 2 weeks or so with the Bentley text. And I think that Bentley text will become a key resource for you for Tuesday's quiz. There's a couple of pages at the end of the text that were not included in earlier benchmarks. So just note those and just read them straight through. A couple of big themes that come out in this section of the Bentley text. First of all, is some of the economic strength of the Abbasid Empire. And to some degree, this really includes the Umayyads as well. We see expansion and conquest under the Umayyads, but we also see pretty early on significant economic trade. By the time you get to the Abbasid period, even despite all the political fragmentation, there is a great deal of economic trade, and some of this, happens in specific ways. So some of the key takeaways that you'll read about in the Bentley text. First of all, the state itself, so the caliph, is really invested in improving economic activity. Some of this is related to the infrastructure, for roads. So, even today, when you think about what makes business happen in the United States or around the world, we take it for granted, but things like, Federal Express or Amazon, there's a great deal of infrastructure that enables there to be a quick, fast delivery system, for example, with goods that get distributed today. In the time period of the Islamic Empire, the government is paying careful attention to supporting things like maritime trade, ensuring that crops are able to be watered well, that people have a place to stay when they are traveling, either going on Hajj or traveling for business. So there's a great deal of movement within this empire, and there's a great deal of state involvement. There's also like entire new industries that get started, just like our modern time banking is really key because you end up with groups of people who are pursuing innovations, maybe getting funds from a bank or other kinds of investors. So the startup funds, in a sense, during the time period of the Islamic Empire are really coming from the state. So that's really important. We do see a growth of very specific trade, and this is happening in a land-based way as well as maritime trade. So we'll see the Islamic Empire connect largely with some of the areas that had been historically dominant on the Silk Road. A great example of this is when we looked at Uzbekistan, and we looked at some of the cities in Uzbekistan that some of those cities had significance on the Silk Road, so their connections to Asia and East Asia in terms of China and other trading centers, but this will also incorporate the Silk Road, all the way essentially to, almost, Constantinople. The Islamic Empire will try to conquer Constantinople, and until the 1400s, won't be successful. A couple of other really big takeaways. You do have a lot of increase in technology and science, particularly in maritime trade. So, using ships and boats. So, the Arab uh, ship becomes really a specific kind of ship. It's like lightweight, travels through the Indian Ocean pretty rapidly, and we end up with a lot of Arab traders. And some of this is just based on increasing knowledge of the seas, everything from map making to technology to help, mariners find their ways in the seas. You also have greater agricultural diversity. This is a really big deal. We see a pattern with this. When agriculture booms, populations tend to boom, and there tends to be better nutrition. A lot of this is really coming from increased knowledge, not only the fact that food is going, and food seeds, for example, what people plant in different parts of the Islamic Empire. Some of that diversity of what gets planted where increases as people move around. But a lot of this is also being shared via knowledge. So the advent of paper and the advent of people writing things down enables there to be a great deal of information about the production of food and the production of agricultural goods that enables an increase in food production. We also see food production and the agricultural boom really start to connect with trade. So you get increases in food production, and we saw this in Western Europe. As a result of that happening, we start to see additional increases of city and urban activities, right? So people involved in merchant activities, banking, and various types of artisan activities. In some of the city centers, the Abbasids are notably urban, that this becomes a really big focus and an increase, something that we see in activity. You'll have like open markets, for example, that become really dominant in the way people sell goods. So lots of opportunities. Remember that Muhammad was a merchant, so there's a lot of praise for economic and merchant activity. And there's a great deal of support for this, regardless of the political fragmentation. So even places that are outside of the Abbasid Empire politically, but are Muslim societies, predominantly Muslim societies, we see a lot of participation in a common like trade zone. There's also a great number of rules that make the trade zone especially fair, and that becomes also really important. There's, stability within the trade routes. Trade routes are protected, and that is also important. Paper is serving a lot of purposes, certainly for scholars and for other groups of people, but we also see industry of books and book selling, book binding become really important. So Baghdad has just like streets and streets of booksellers. And we also see a lot of interest in the Abbasid administration. So there's a lot of like bureaucracy, groups of people who will become working for the government or the caliph, and some of these people's roles will be particularly to document some government affairs, documenting some of that increased food production, to document what's coming and going in terms of trade. So there just becomes a lot of like administrative record keeping that is really connected to the way the Abbasids are ruling. That becomes really, really important. Okay, a couple of other really big takeaways that you're going to see in the text. There is an incredible amount of cultural diversity throughout the Abbasid Empire. First of all, it's massive, right? There are very high political roles for Muslims. Even some Christians and Jews are maintaining some degree of autonomy, in some cases, even some political power, despite the fact that they'll pay a tax and won't be able to serve in the military. Note that this is a society too that has slavery, which might be a temporary phase for some people, but slavery not uncommon in all the parts of the world. There's a lot of Arabic, Persian, and to some extent Turkic culture and language. In the Abbasid period, we see especially Persian culture influence literature and art, literature in the form of poetry, very, very dominant Persian poetry. In the forms of art, we actually see in Persian art miniatures of individuals. It's very rare in any type of art within Islamic societies for there to be representation of life forms, especially individuals who have significance in the religion. It would be seen as idolizing a a work rather than idolizing God. So it's problematic to have what in, say, for example, Byzantine, we looked at a dependence on icons. That would be generally something more taboo in Islam. In Persia, there's some exception to that. So Persians will adopt Islam but maintain some of traditional art forms, and we see Persian miniatures, which include lots and lots of representations, for example, of Islamic scholars. Okay, so that's something that you might note. A couple of things about the role of women, and you'll see this in the text. The Quran immediately increases some of the rights for women in very specific ways. For example, was open polygamy in the Islamic Empire for men, and at first there was not really a limit on the number of wives that men could have. Over time, that changes. Sharia law will offer to some degree some greater rights for women. Some of the role of polygamy in this society and other societies at the time, it's actually fairly common in the Middle Ages. Some of this is for the purpose of ensuring if women become widowed that they have economic support. So being married, again, to somebody else. So Muhammad, for example, has a wife, Khadijah. After her death, he will take on several wives. It's seen as very, very common in Islamic Empire. At the same time, there is this insurance, in a sense, to take care of women. We also see some restrictions on social rights for women. Some of this might include what we saw in Byzantine. So upper class women in the Byzantine Empire had largely been excluded. And we see some of those expectations of modesty having to be maybe seen in public with a male who is a relative, maybe veiling of women and things like that. So we see to some degree an increase in patriarchal activity where men dominate, but we also see some increased rights for women. So there's a little bit of both of those things happening. You'll read a little bit about the Sufis in the Bentley text. The Sufis become instrumental, especially in some areas where Islam spreads, for example, in India. But we see Sufis all over the Islamic world. They still exist today. I had a student some years ago told me his mom was a Sufi, so there's a lot of ways in which this tradition is still practiced. The big takeaway about Sufis will be a little bit of a challenge to the way that like kind of adherence to religious texts becomes the way to practice religion in groups of Islamic scholars outside of Sufism. The focus on Islam ends up being Sharia law and particular rules that set up the culture and the way of life for Muslims. So people are following largely an expected set of rules in the society. And for Muslims, this set of rules kind of dictate how one becomes, religious. Sufis challenge that a little bit. Sufism is going to be much more spiritual and mystical. Sufi poets, for example, will challenge the idea of just knowing God through the exclusive religious texts and memorizing them and knowing them. It becomes more of like a feeling type of exercise. Some groups of Sufis will use dance. Some groups of Sufis will use poetry, essentially to, make a case for finding God in their hearts. Okay, so that's really very much kind of part of the Sufism, but it becomes a very attractive way for people to practice Islam, and it also creates, in some ways, some challenges to more conservative traditional practices of Islam. And throughout the Islamic Empire, we see some division in the way in which people might be more conservative around religious values and uphold like what is exclusively in religious texts, and then groups of people who might be practicing religion in those same religious texts, but in a way that perhaps is a little bit more open-ended and a little bit more connected to things like poetry and like spiritual exercises. Some of the Sufi poets connect religious experience to experiences that one might have under, the influence in a sense. It's almost like a outer body type of experience, and Sufis kind of seek to achieve that. Okay, so in any case, I hope that that helps a little bit for eyeballing some of the text. Hopefully, the Bentley text will also give you some additional content to work with in our in-class activity. My biggest suggestion with that is, in addition to